thank you, Daryl, for the introduction. Hola, me llamo Anaid Yerena. Nací en México, soy la hija de Delia, la nieta de Emma Delia, y estoy aquí con ustedes hoy muy orgullosa de compartir un poco acerca de mis ideas. Hi, my name is Anaid Yerena. I was born in Mexico. I am the granddaughter of Emma Delia and the daughter of Delia. I am very proud to be here today to share with you a little bit about my research. And I will be doing so by clicking on lots of buttons all at once, so I apologize in advance if you notice that some things don't seem to be moving at the speed we would expect them to. So I click once here, all right. So I join you here today from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people. In particular, I live and work on the ancestral lands of the Puyallup tribe, known as the Welcoming People. Here you can see a sculpture that stands next to our campus of the Puyallup Welcome figure by Sean Peterson. And that is the motion that this figure is doing. It is welcoming all visitors to the city. I intentionally pause in this moment to acknowledge the histories of dispossession and forced removal of all Indigenous people and reflect on this history in ways that honor the memory of those dispossessed and keep us committed to the cause of social justice for Indigenous populations. With gratitude and humility, I commit to creating reciprocal partnerships that honor Indigenous cultures and ways of knowing, and recognize their significant contributions to the broader community. I do so by respecting the agency and sovereignty of First Peoples, prioritizing care for the land, demanding justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and disrupting ongoing practices of settler colonialism. I also honor and acknowledge our local hosts, the Nipmuc people, on whose ancestral land we gather here today. I also wish to thank the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, in particular the Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning Department, the generous Zube Lecture Series Endowment, for inviting me to share and discuss my work with you today. I also wish to express extra appreciation to my amazing hosts, Dr. Daryl Ramsey Mulsoff and Stacy Richardson, who have taken care of every little detail of my visit to this beautiful corner of the world. As you can see, it was not easy for me to get, as you can see from the map, it is not easy to get from all the way on the other side of the country to where we are here today. I would also like to thank my loved ones, I would also like to thank my loved ones whose kindness and support nurture me every day. And finally, I also thank all of you for being here and spending part of this beautiful afternoon of the second day of September of 2021 in conversation with me. I'm going to start with a little bit about my story, and this is how I tend to introduce myself when I'm visiting with a new friend or participating and collaborating with new community members. I do a lot of community engaged work. And so I would start by sharing with you a little bit of my trajectory to where I am here today. So I was born in 1982, as I mentioned earlier, in Mexico, to two Mexican parents, and all my grandparents are Mexican. From the years of 1985 to about 2000, I made the trajectory of, or I lived in many places. The places or cities included places in Mexico, the United States, and the United Kingdom, several back and forths. So I had what I would call a multicultural and bilingual upbringing, and that experience impacts the lens, the multicultural lens through which I view the world, and of course now impacts the research that I do. One important thing that I wanted to mention here is that in this process of visiting many places and being a part of many communities, I learned how to make many places my home. So I got into the practice of making my homes. between the years of 2000 and 2008, that is when I studied my educational career as an architect and my practice as an architect. I studied at the University of Monterrey in Mexico, in the city of Monterrey, and then I practiced as an architect in Southern California. Following a few years of practice, I realized practice as a commercial architect mainly. I did a little residential as well. I realized that I was interested in engaging and better understanding the rules of the game, and to do so, not only because I was now practicing as an immigrant in a completely different context, regulatory context, in a different, actually the construction style are completely different. So I realized that I wanted to learn more about the rules of engagement. And I found planning to be one of those spaces beyond adding just additional training in architecture or design. Planning provided me the option of engaging with rules, policies, regulations, zoning, understanding, again, how cities in the US are organized through planning. And that's how I chose my master's in urban and regional planning at the University of California, Irvine. And as I started my master's degree, I realized that the place where my interest in design that came from architecture and my newfound passion for social justice came together for me was in housing. That was the place where those two combined. Housing very much has a physical manifestation in this world, and it is an issue of social justice from the lens that I view and study housing. So that encouraged me, alongside the fact that I had the good fortune of meeting a wonderful advisor, Dr. Victoria Basolo, encouraged me to stick around for another 6 years, I didn't know how many, to study more in depth what could be done. At the time, I thought that I was going to be dedicating my time to improving design for better access in housing, but the more I studied and the more I understood the landscape of housing in the United States, the more I understood that that was maybe 10 or 15 steps away, hopefully not many generations away from where I stand here today, but definitely we're not in the space to have that conversation of space efficiency and energy efficiency all the way before we address the foundational issues, which is housing is a basic human right. And then we can talk about how we make sure that every human being that is part of our society has access to that right. But because we are not in that part of the conversation, I nixed my plans to study housing and design and focused on what is the first phase of my, what is the first phase of my research of my work. And I talk about it pre-tenure, which is collective action. So this is how do we, as members of the society, influence and take part in shaping the policies that are on the ground? How do we exert influence over decision makers? And I did so based on the training I had received up to that point through a Eurocentric and dominant culture focus, or through that lens. Very much what I expect most of us in higher education are exposed to. So not only what is the planning history, and looking at planning history as having started in the 1900s, many, many years after these lands had already been occupied and cared for, stewarded by Indigenous and First Peoples. But we've managed to keep aside that story and focus on the Eurocentric part of the story. So that's very much the place that I came to my work from. That's where I started, and that phase, there was a transition, but I will say ended last year when I obtained tenure. Now, as an associate professor, looking at, so what do I want to dedicate the next 5 to 6 years of my career to doing? Now it's entering this second phase, which is, again, looking at the collective action and the changes that we can make, but through a decolonized perspective. So understanding the process of decolonization and the role that it plays in housing. So my hope is for this conversation to inspire and motivate us to act and reimagine the current structures that keep housing, a basic human need, out of reach from many in the U.S., or out of the reach of many in the U.S. And if you thought this was already interesting, it's about to get more interesting, because now I'm going to elicit your input. So again, part of the approach to decolonized or indigenizing my pedagogy has involved making sure that the process of learning, and as I see it is actually co-learning, involves all of the brilliant minds in the room, and not assumes that because one person has a certain title or happens to be standing in one part of the room, has access to more information or more or better knowledge. And so we're going to engage in a little bit of that process here together by, fingers crossed, trying to do this in a socially distant way, using some of the tools available to us, but we need to see if they're going to work out. So I pose for you the question, and this one is a word association. So can you think of one word that comes to mind when someone says housing? And when I turn on the feature that will allow for you to participate remotely through a smart device, if you happen to have a smart device, if you're comfortable or prefer to, raise your hand and say your answer, I have a smart device that I will use to record your answer. I'm giving you the options. So if you have whether it's a tablet, a laptop, or a cell phone, you might want to start taking that out now. You'll be able to either use the browser or text your responses. But again, if you're like, I'm more comfortable just raising my hand and giving you my answer, they're one-word answers. That's the one request, is that you keep it to one word. And this one will be a practice because we're going to do 2 follow-up activities. And if anybody has a word that they'd like to share with me, I can use it as my test to record it here. You can do that. Oh, I don't see the rest of the instructions. They're not showing up on the screen for some reason. The other instruction is if you're using a text, you can send a text to the number 37607. I'm going to write it on the board. And enter the one word, Prof. Yerena. Yeah, that's a fancy new feature they've added now that there's a QR code instead of the instructions. 37607. And again, anybody who would like to raise their hand and participate a different way is happy. I'm happy to help out. I'm ready to record your answers. My next question for you is, what would you like your housing arrangement to feel like? And now you have the words up there with the instructions presenting directly from Poll Everywhere. So what would you like it to feel like? It's clear that I have some designers in the room. They're adding some of those words that we definitely think about as designers, not only in housing, but in hopefully all of our designs. All right, so the next part of the activity will be I'm going to try to compare our two clouds, the two word clouds that we've created. Okay, so we've created two visuals with, yes, slightly two different questions. One was, this more abstract concept of housing out in the world. And then another one was actually the same concept, but much more personal, much more individualized. I made it about us. I made it about me. I made it about you. And so when we look and compare the words that we associate or that we think of that are elicited in our brains when thinking about housing in the abstract versus housing in the concrete, in the one that actually has a very direct impact on my life, on my mental health, on my ability to participate in community, on my ability to have a place to rest at night, to express my individuality, to form my identity. I have a whole set of different words of what I expect housing to be or what I hope housing is. And I love that affordable showed up on the right-hand side because very much that is the discourse, the reigning discourse, the dominant discourse around housing that is good is housing that is affordable. In other words, it's housing that can be paid for, housing that can be consumed, housing that can be exchanged for a certain value in the capitalistic system, which indeed is the economic system that we work on. On the other hand, we also had comfort, we have shelter, we have an affordability, so that we could compound those two into referring to the affordability component, expensive. Again, so we're very much thinking of the commodity that is housing. And then when we take a look at, again, the individualized, the one that impacts my ability to thrive as a human being, I think about comfort. I think about safety. I think about welcoming, queer. I want to identify in that space. I want to be myself in that space. I want it to be permanent. I want it to be diverse, cozy, warm, walkable. I mean, all of these words that we all came up with are very much the place that I would hope that the actions and the reimagination that I'm inviting all of us to partake on moves us towards in our individual actions. So I'll start here and I'll end in this same place. In the individual actions that we take, in the institutional decisions that we make, as well as at the ideological level, where again we move from thinking of it as thinking of housing as a commodity, and move towards it being a basic human need, which therefore can translate it into a basic human right. Okay, so again, thank you for. Oh, we're not done. So there's more that I wanted to see, but I think I started on this one, and I wanted to elicit your input on seeing the differences that you saw. I'm going to do that in case there are any other differences that you noticed having those two word clouds, and then maybe now after I've shared, I've pulled back the curtain a little bit about what differences I was hoping to elicit from you, and I'm going to ask you to think about what stood out to you between the two word clouds and this exercise. What stood out to you? What are you left with? What would you like to, maybe a takeaway that you'd like to reflect on during the rest of my talk and hopefully beyond my talk? Now you can actually write or type in full sentences. These will appear as little bubbles. So it doesn't have to be a one-word response. Now we have the ability to have comments. And again, if you'd like to participate by raising your hand and sharing your response with me, I'm happy to collect and capture your response as well. And I do this strategy is not only because there might be technical difficulties or because it helps me test the technology, but also because I don't want to assume that everybody shows up with a device that is able to text or connect, and that is definitely not a good enough reason for that voice, those thoughts, those ideas to be lost to the rest of us. So very much a matter of accessibility. We kind of stuck with a theme of a word or two, but we have, so that the contrasting here, some people identified it being attainable versus idealistic. There was comfort identified in both at the abstract level as well as the one that is closer to home, closer to us. Having the privilege to want more of housing than just shelter. And yes, that housing has become a privilege, and actually shelter, I would argue, is a privilege in this country. There are emotional desires versus practical challenges related to housing, and the way we saw these two concepts and answer these two questions. The reality versus the ideal. The reality being like the crises, the natural disasters, the current natural environment and the context in which housing and the rest of us exist, and what we would like, our desires, and I would argue it's our desires and our needs to actually have permanent, stable housing. There's comfort versus the crisis polarities. Let's see. What else can I read? Emotional desires versus practical challenges. Code switching when talking about housing as an institution versus housing as my home based on my identity. In this case, as a queer, holding a queer identity, and how that matters in the way we think about or approach decision-making and policy-making around housing. Like that, doing that code switch is actually oppressive and exclusionary. The social and ethical distance between the two. Empathy would help looking at housing as something that is very much, that cuts off. So what I'm guessing is it's a part of you or something that impacts you. And again, so this is intended to be the framing behind why I'm so interested in looking at housing and, as you would your own home, the detached versus personal, housing as intellectual and for other people, and then when it's mine, it's my home. All right, so we're going to go back to, and thank you all for participating and starting, there we go. So in very clear and I would argue very effective ways, you have contributed to the exigency for my work, the need for this type of work. It's because it's not just conceptual and political and somewhere up in the cloud. It is because it very much impacts our lives, our humanity, and our ability, as I said earlier, to thrive as human beings. So let's see if I can catch up with my notes over here. Okay, I'm here. So contemporary unfettered capitalism leaves basic human needs such as decent and stable shelter unmet. That's not what it's intended to accomplish, which to me is the foundation for why moving away, not just from that as an economic, the economic organization, but how we understand it, and again, how we conceptualize what housing is for us and in our society is the first step. Continuing to do what we've been doing for the past 2 centuries that has led us to the place where we are today of crisis, I think it's been tried long enough. Very smart people have come up with a lot of ideas and approaches and programs and policies and laws. We're still where we are today. So for me, I'm going to try something different. I'm going to stop trying the same approaches which I very much believed in and wanted to work in the first in the first phase of my work. And now saying, well, okay, let's try something different. Let's see what we could achieve and where we could go if we look at it from another perspective. Current approaches to affordable housing focus on policy and legislative strategies that explicitly uphold white dominant culture and perpetuate capitalistic practices and legacies of settler colonialism, while undermining and erasing the knowledge, innovation, and social contributions of Indigenous, Black, and other individuals from marginalized communities. Now, this is well established even in the planning literature already. These practices and legacies fuel the current housing crisis in the US and much of the global north. I'm not arguing that this is a problem unique to this country. All right, so my claim there is, my work argues that to counteract these forces, we must decolonize housing. To do so, I draw on epistemological and theoretical traditions, from Indigenous studies to identify approaches to shelter that support community resilience, particularly in times of crisis, as the global pandemic has shown us that we need these plans in place. I will examine examples from different cultures, in particular those from Indigenous peoples, the Global South, and communitarian societies. And I'm using the future tense because I forgot to make a point in a previous slide on my trajectory, and that is that today, in addition to celebrating Jamie's birthday, I am celebrating the first official day of my sabbatical. And the reason I say that is because a big part of what I'm going to dedicate this time to is to understand and take stock and learn, and as I argue later in my presentation, unlearn a lot of what I've encountered around housing up to this point. So I will examine examples from different cultures, in particular, oh yeah, I already mentioned this, sorry. And I will take stock of the many modes of shelter that are possible beyond the hegemonic model of housing that clings to individualistic approaches. So again, this is the single family being the right way to be housed, the best way, the only way, the desirable way. Just, it should not have any of these value-laden adjectives automatically attached to it. It is just one form of tenure. It is a way of a choice. It should be a choice of tenure, not the best or the one that we should all be working towards. And my work, let's see, where am I? I'm confused at what I'm clicking on. Okay. This work supports the radical imagination needed to change how we address the shelter needs of all members of society and contribute to a future that centers healing, justice, and fosters thriving communities. So again, it's not about can you purchase it. It's not about making more affordable housing accessible and purchasable, and in some ways keeping the issue of housing very much in the space of its value, its exchange value in society, and moving it towards its actual use value in society as well. It is very difficult to imagine a space where I could come here today to be prepared to share my ideas with you if I didn't have a place to rest my head at night, to recover from all the work that I did the day before so that I could come here, right? And so, and that is what is at stake for individuals who are unsheltered. It's not just about whether they're deserving or not. Their humanity makes them deserving of a shelter. But that is currently not how we think about it in our society. And let's see if I catch up here, because I want to speak to the microphone, and when I look that way, I'm definitely not doing that. So the way I am defining decolonization is I refer to decolonization as the dismantling of the cultural logic of colonialism. Decolonization is as much a process as it is a goal. There we go. It requires a profound centering on Indigenous worldviews. Let's see. As Syed Hassan, a Toronto-based activist, states, Decolonization is a dramatic reimagining of relationships with land, people, and the state. Much of this requires study, it requires conversation, it is a practice, it is an unlearning. Remember that concept of unlearning that I mentioned would come back in my talk. And so here I bring to you a quote from the late James Baldwin. "I am what time, circumstance, history have made of me, certainly, but I am also much more than that. So are we all." And it's that notion that I have been trained, educated, exposed, deformed as an individual in this white dominant culture, and it very much has influenced where I am and where I've gotten to today. But there's also the part of my agency that can break away from that, realize the places where I need to do some unlearning, and so that I can realize my full potential, not just as a scholar, but as a human being, as a participant of this world. And then the last slide, because I know we're 1 minute away from time, is so this action and reimagination that are needed to make this shift, to decolonize housing, needs to happen at 3 levels. I mentioned them earlier. At the individual, so that's why I buy a home, that thinking, that rationale, that's on me. That's a shift where I need to decolonize my way, my approach of thinking about housing for myself. We also need to act and reimagine what happens at the institutional level. So when we're talking about laws, the rules, the zoning, what does our zoning encourage? What type of tenure choices are privileged over others? And or even just the fact that there is no mention of the tax rules for co-housing models means that it's almost like erased. It's not an option. It's not acceptable. So identifying and in bringing the conversation around these other modalities or other modes of tenure and of shelter, bringing those into the conversation at the institutional level. And then, of course, as I mentioned and I argued throughout, at the ideological level, where housing is less seen as a commodity and moved into the space where it's recognized as a basic human right. So thank you all so much for your time today.